Best German Grandmaster Vincent Keimer starts the game with the move d4, and the best American chess player of this generation, Fabiano Caruana, plays d5. And this is round 8 in Tata Steel Super GM tournament in Netherlands. White continues with c4, e6, knight c3, and we have queen's gambit decline, knight f6, exchange variation that leads to a positional game. Let's start with the move bishop g5. It's very important to first move the bishop and only then play the move e3, not vice versa, because if you play e3 here to allow the white squared bishop to go to this diagonal, then you're blocking your black squared bishop. So first, the black squared bishop gets developed to f4 or g5, in this case g5, pinning the knight to the queen. Bishop goes to e7, e3, c6, supporting the pawn on d5, bishop d3, the best diagonal for the bishop, and black moves the knight to d7. And in the future, it can go in different directions to b6 or f8, so we'll see where it goes next. White plays similar move, knight from g1 to e2, preparing the castle, and black plays knight f8. Knight f8 with the idea to play knight e6, attacking the bishop on g5. White plays queen c2, that's creating a battery to potentially threaten the pawn on h7, but that's in the future. Right now it's all protected, and black plays knight e6, asking the question to the bishop where it will go. It's basically one good square only, and it goes to h4, g6, that's for future protection of this diagonal, and also in the future black potentially can put the knight or bishop on square f5. White goes rook d1. Honestly, not sure about this move. Logically, more logically, I would say rook c1 looks better, but not gonna argue with the grandmaster. He knows better. So rook d1, castle, castle, a5. Fabiano Caruana starting his attack on the queen side of the board, activating his pawns, and white plays knight c1, another move that I was not sure about, because as we will see in a couple of moves, the knight will go back to e2. So that to me looks like a loss of tempo. Black plays knight g7 with the idea to put the bishop on f5. But they're not on time, because white plays f3, and now if the next move bishop goes to f5, white will counter that move with e4, breaking in the center and creating a great pawn center in the middle of the board with the tempo, attacking that bishop on f5. Therefore, the bishop goes to e6, and knight returns back to e2. So that maneuver of the knight from c1, from e2 to c1 to e2, um, I am not sure why it was, what was the purpose of that. Rook c8, potentially in some positions to go for a break for c5. King goes to h1. It's a prophylactic move, often used in this type of positions, just in case there would be never a check on this diagonal after queen b6. Knight goes back to d7, offering an exchange of bishops, but white declines the exchange offer and moves back to f2. b5, attacking on the queen side. Knight goes to a very nice square and active position on f4, and black plays knight b6. Now this bishop on e6 is not the strongest piece in black's position, as it blocked by the pawns of the same color. So to exchange this bishop is not advantageous for white. And they finally play e4. This was their plan all along, to create a very nice pawn center. This particular position is a little better for white, and black understands that, and they start creating some counterplay using and activating the bishops. Bishop g5, attacking the knight on f4, bishop e3 protecting the knight, and here, after exchange of the pawns, bishop goes to g4, attacking the rook on d1. White's position is still better, but they have to be really careful and make very precise moves. Otherwise, black can gain an advantage very quickly. And the first mistake is knight e2, basically putting the knight under a pin, which was not necessary. The easiest way to protect the rook was just to move the rook to e1, keeping the advantage. After knight e2, black immediately plays a very nice move, f5. And the position becomes more favorable for black. Their pieces are very active, the bishops are very active, and they immediately attack the pawn on e4, and they want to break this nice center that white created with the pawns. So f5 is a very nice and very educational type of move in this type of positions. So after exchange of the pawns, knight from g7, passive position, goes to f5, where it's very active, attacking the bishop on e3. Queen b3 check. So now the king cannot move away to h8 because knight e6 with the fork. Therefore, black protects the king with the move knight c4, and they're not afraid to lose a pawn after bishop takes c4, b takes c4, queen takes c4, and rook f7. White has material advantage. They have an extra pawn, but the pawn on d4 is pretty weak because it's an isolated pawn. It's not protected by any other pawns. Also, black knight on f5 is absolutely monstrous, and the black bishops are very active. So black has initiative, white has a pawn, and the game continues with the move bishop c1. It was under attack, so it moved away. Queen e7, creating more pressure on white's position. Rook e1, defending move, and here goes bishop h4, attacking the rook on e1. Knight goes to g3, blocking the bishop from attacking the rook. Everything seems to be protected in white's position. So black goes queen b4, and after exchange of the queens and exchange of the knights, we have a position where white still have an extra pawn, but again, black bishops are dominating the position here. Therefore, this position considered slightly better for black. White continues with the move g3, attacking the bishop. Bishop goes back to f6, and here's a nice move d5. The move d5 is made in order to get rid of this isolated weak pawn on d4. And now if c takes d5, knight will go to, now it will capture the pawn on d5 and will go to a very nice active position in the middle of the board. And this position would be already even. And white has all the chances to play even for a win. So therefore, smart way to play it is not to take the pawn on d5, but move the bishop to d7. White goes knight d3, attacking the pawn on b4, so here is an exchange of the pawns. And black plays bishop b5. Again, the bishops are cutting the position left and right, attacking the rooks constantly, and so the rook. And finally, in this particular moment, Vincent Keimer made a critical mistake in this game. He put the rook on a very awkward square on f4. And the reason this move is not great, because of the move rook e7. That's a very fun move to make. The bishop is under attack, but the rook is under attack. But what happens is if you take the rook on e7, the rook takes c1 with the check, which is very important. Kings go away, and black captures the rook, and they have an extra piece and totally winning position. So therefore, in this position, white is considerably worse. They play bishop d2, rook takes e1, bishop takes e1, bishop goes to e5, attacking the rook on f4, and it turns out that the rook doesn't really have many squares to go to. Wherever it goes, let's say rook f3, the next move would be rook c1, pinning the white bishop to the king, and you cannot really protect it. You cannot really protect the bishop. Let's say you go rook e3, bishop d4, and the rook really doesn't have any moves to remain on the line of the e file and still protecting the bishop. So the only move would be rook e6, and after king f7, we can see that every single square on e file is under control for black pieces, and the white will lose a piece, lose a bishop on e1, and will lose the game. So in this particular position, uh, after rook c1, sorry, after bishop e5, white realized that they have nowhere to go with the rook, so they sacrificed an exchange. Bishop takes f4, g takes f4. The rest of the game is very technical by Caruana. This type of positions are winnable by grandmasters 100 out of 100 times. So I will go quickly. King f7. Will not pay much attention to the next series of moves. Again, black's position is totally winning. And I'll just show you the end of the game where we can see another very nice tactical shot. Now d4 is the move I would like to mention in this particular position. The move d4 looks kind of counterintuitive because you put the pawn under the attack of two white pieces. But this turns out to be the best move, because if you take the pawn with the bishop, then bishop d5, pinning the knight on f3 and attacking the bishop at the same time, you're going to lose one or the other. And if knight takes d4, then a quick maneuvering by the rook. Rook d3, attacking the bishop cannot go back to e1 because the knight on d4 is under attack. And if the bishop goes to b2, there is a check, and you lose a bishop. And if the bishop goes to a1, rook a3, bishop b2 the only move, rook a2, pinning the bishop, and game is over. So because of that, white didn't take the pawn on d4, moved the bishop away on b2, bishop d5, king f2, couple of more moves, d2, king e2, and here f3. f3, white resigned. Why they resigned? Because if they take the pawn, rook f1 check, and queen is the winning position. And if white takes the rook f2, f2, queen on f1, so king goes to e2, and then you either go d1 or f1 with the queen, and the other pawn becomes a queen. So very nice win by Fabiano Caruana, and now he has 4.5 points out of 8. He didn't have the best start of the tournament, but he is gaining steam, and with more games to play, I would not be surprised that he will end up in the top 3 or possibly even win this tournament. So we'll see what happens next. The next game I would like to show is the game between two Indian top grandmasters. Pragnananda is playing white against the world champion Gukesh, who is playing black. Pragnananda starts with e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5. We have a Rui Lopez Spanish game. Knight f6, that's a Berlin variation. And here there is a lot of theory. So in order not to go to the main variations and actually keep more chances of winning, white plays d3, protecting the pawn on e4. Bishop c5, developing the bishop to a nice diagonal. Bishop takes c6, not the most popular move. So what happens after bishop takes c6? Black actually gain an advantage of 2 bishops, which is important in open positions. But the bad news for them that they have double pawns. So we have some pluses and minuses for both sides here. Now in this position you cannot take the pawn e5 because after queen d4 we have a checkmate threat and white are gonna lose the knight because they need to protect the checkmate. So in this position, castle, queen e7. Now we need to defend this pawn, and knight goes to d2. The reason knight goes to d2, not to c3, because from c3 it really doesn't have any moves. Sorry, doesn't have any moves because the pawn on c6 protects squares b5 and d5. But from d2, the knight eventually can go to f1, g3, the usual standard maneuvering of the knight in this openings, or to go to c4. So we'll see where it goes next. Black plays a5, expanding on the queen side. The knight goes to c4, actually. Makes sense, attacking the pawn on e5 with 2 knights. So it has to be defended, and the knight goes to d7, which is also not the most pleasant move to make. First of all, you go back, which is always passive, and then the bishop from c8 cannot go, cannot get developed on either g4 or e6 squares because it's getting blocked by the knight. White plays c4 with the idea, standard idea in these openings, to make a pawn break and gain the center by the move d4. Black castle, queen c2, b6. Obviously you need to develop the bishop. It's blocked here, so it has to be going in the other direction. Rook e1, bishop a6. And here b3, another move to support this knight. Rook e8, just developing moves, and finally d4. That's the whole idea of this position. Now, it's not advantageous, it's not desirable for black to take the pawn on d4 because after exchange of the pawns, white has tremendous center, pawn center. Black do not have any pawns on files D and E, so this pawn center is very scary for black, so therefore they don't take the pawn on d4, but instead take the knight on c4, which is a very important move, because also let's not forget that the pawn on e5 in some variations is under attack, so and the bishop is under attack right now. So bishop c4 is a very important intermediate move. B takes c4, and bishop goes back to d6, keeping the pressure in the middle. So the pressure in the middle is in for black's advantage. So again, in this position, you don't want to take on d4 because this pawn center is absolutely monstrous. Bishop d6, bishop d2, a4, expanding again on the queen side. Rook goes to d1, f6, another protection for the pawn on e5, g3, that's a prophylactical move just for future. So the king can go get away on square g2, just in case there would be no checkmates on the first rank. And the reason g3 was played instead of h3 is because black has a black squared bishop. So if white played h3, in some variations that black bishop would control this h2 square and the king would not be able to escape. g3 normally is not considered the best move because you weaken your white squares, but here you can do it because black doesn't have a white squared bishop on the board. So you can't play g3, black plays queen f7, attacking the pawn on c4. d5 is a very logical response, extending the pawns and also protecting the pawn on c4. But it has its minuses because the square on c5 becomes very good for the knight, and the knight immediately goes there, knight c5. Bishop e3, potentially, maybe to take the knight, to eliminate the knight from this nice square on c5, and also to open the rook. And here, a very deep move by Gukesh. He plays knight to b7, and the reason he does that is because he realizes that the pawn on c4 is very weak and he has to attack it. And the best way to attack it is to remove the knight to b7 and then a5 and attack the pawn on c4. So white plays, it takes the pawn on c6 and knight a5. And now both pawns are under attack. Pragnananda has a tactical shot here that he uses. Bishop takes b6. And now if you take the bishop, white takes the bishop on d6 and get a very, very pleasant position with the pawn on c6. That's actually dangerous. Therefore, after bishop takes b6, black plays knight takes c4. Knight takes c4, and now they threaten to take this bishop with the knight. Or they can even take it with the pawn because knight protects the bishop on d6. So the bishop has to move away to e3. Rook goes to the open file on b8, and white immediately counter that with rook b1. And in this particular position, the best move for black was very difficult to find for a human. The move that continues black's advantage was the move rook d8. And the reason this move is good, because now after rook d8, the threat of knight a3 is pretty important. So there is a fork threat, and let's say if the queen moves away, then knight takes e3, and you cannot take the knight with the queen because the pawn on a2 is hanging. So you would have to take it with pawn f, and now as you can see, these pawns are isolated, doubled, and are plain ugly. And this position is really in favor of black. So this was the move that continued black advantage. Gukesh didn't find it and played a more logical move, a3, with the idea to put the rook on b2. But white are first. They're playing rook b7. Rook b7, exchange of the rooks. Rooks go to b8, attacking the pawn on b7. It has to be protected, so queen b3. Knight takes the bishop on e3. F takes e3. Let's take a look if white takes with the rook. Queen takes b3. A takes b3. And rook b7. This pawn is under attack, and white's position is dangerous. So therefore, white took the knight with pawn f. Exchange of the queens on b3 still happened. Rook takes b7, attacking the pawn on b3, but now knight goes to d2, protecting this pawn. As always in the endgames, you want your king to be closer to the action, to the middle of the board, so king f7, logical. Rook goes to a1 to block the very dangerous pawn on a3. King continued to go to the middle, same with white, g6, rook a2. And in this position, Gukesh realized that nothing much he gained in the previous 10-15 moves. He had some advantage, but in this particular position, it's an even game. So f5, queen, king f3, and after h5, he actually offered a draw that Pragnanand accepted. And both Indian grandmasters now got 5.5 out of 8 and are leading the tournament together with Abdusadorov from Uzbekistan. But we'll see the standings a little later in this video. Right now I want to show you quickly the end of the game between Max Warmerdam, grandmaster from Netherlands, and Wei Yi, grandmaster from China, who actually won this tournament last year. In this particular position, black has an extra exchange. They have two rooks against one, bishop against bishop, and knight. So it's two rooks against a rook and a knight. So that's extra exchange for black. And white has an extra pawn. Pawn on e6 is weak. And the position is even overall. So position is even, but here Warmerdam makes a mistake. He plays bishop d4. Not easy to understand why this is a mistake right away. But after bishop e8, a move that not easy to see because anytime you move the pieces back, you would think it's a passive move, but in this case, you see that's an extra attack on the rook on a4. And the next move by white was a critical mistake, knight c4. And the reason this is a critical mistake is because of the next move by Wei Yi, e5. Absolutely great shot in the middle. Chinese grandmaster putting the pawn under attack of not one, but two white pieces. And it turns out that no matter what you do next, if you take it with the bishop or with the knight, the position is lost for white. So let's say if white took with the bishop, then rook g6, attacking, you see that bishop is attacking the rook on a4, and the pawn on g2 is gonna get lost after the rook will move away. So the pawn on g2, when the pawn on g2 would be lost with a check, then the pawns on f3 and h3 become very weak, and black will dismantle white position. Now in the game, white took the pawn with the knight, but it didn't help because of the move rook d6, pinning the bishop to the king and attacking the rook on a4. So the rook moves to c4. Now another important thing. The bishop is protected only by the rook. So the rook cannot go, let's say, to a1. because black just takes the bishop on d4. Therefore, to continue the fight, white plays rook c4, still protecting this bishop on d4, but here goes bishop b5. Bishop b5, and again, if the rook moves anywhere on the c file, rook takes d4, so rook goes to b4, and the last move a5. a5, and the rook has no moves. No moves. Um, so white took on b5, black took on b5, and now two rooks against bishop and knight. That position is easily winnable, especially by a grandmaster of that level with the rating of 2751. I will not gonna show you the rest of the game. It's pretty easy win by the Chinese grandmaster. And let's take a look at the standings after round 8. We have 3 players on top of the standings. Gukesh Demaraja from India with 5.5 points. Pragnanand Ramesh Babu from India, 5.5 points, and Nazarbek Abdusadar from Uzbekistan with 5.5 points. So 3 leaders. Vladimir Fedoseev representing Serbia is on the 4th place, and Fabiana Caruana, together with Wei and Alexei Sarana, Chinese grandmaster, and Sarana is a Russian grandmaster representing Slovenia, they have 4.5 points. So we have 8 rounds behind us. We have 5 more to go. And I will see you for round number 9. Until then, thank you for watching.